Does the COVID-19 pandemic raise new theological questions? If so, what are they? If not, how does the pandemic fit into the way your tradition has wrestled with the problem of evil? So we'll start with Rabbi Dorff.
As it happens, this past semester, I taught a seminar for rabbinical students on the problem of evil or the problem of unfairness. So there's an awful lot to talk about here, but I'm going to do this very quickly. The Deuteronomy believes that at least not so much as individuals, but as a community, if we follow God's will, then everything good will happen, and we will be among those things. We will not get ill. And on the other hand, if we violate God's laws, then all kinds of bad things will happen, including the fact that we will get sick. But already in the later books of the Hebrew Bible, Job and Ecclesiastes or Kohelet, those people already decide that that's just not the way the world works, and that it is indeed ultimately what the rabbis will say, that a righteous person suffers and an evil person prospers. So how can we understand God's justice in this way? And what the rabbis will do is they actually believe in a life after death in order to preserve God's justice. That's the primary reason why they believed in a life after death. Because if in fact it is the case that good people suffer and evil people prosper in this life, then how can you preserve God's justice? And the answer is that God, or at least their answer is that God's justice comes to bear in a life after death. But then the question is, well, where does that leave us? And I mean, I think what that does is that, and by the way, Jewish thinkers have been wrestling with this ever since. I mean, Jews as individuals have suffered from illnesses just as much as non-Jews have, and Jews as a people have suffered persecutions and pogroms and all of those kinds of things. So that has led to a variety of different philosophical responses to that, including some things being in regard to natural evils and some things in regard to humanly caused evils like the Holocaust. And I think the thing that is most important in terms of the response to all of this is that if we're looking at Jewish theological convictions vis-a-vis the pandemic, I think the most important one for our purposes is that, first of all, we are not individuals on isolated islands. We are members of a family and a community as soon as we're born, and we therefore have the responsibility to take care of each other. And that means that there is no, and I will repeat this, no Jewish reason to refuse to get vaccinated. There may be a medical reason, but not a Jewish reason to refuse to get vaccinated. And we really do need to wear masks when we are out of our homes and social distance, all of the things that the medical authorities are requiring us to do, because the Jewish tradition is very communitarian. It very much sees us as members of a community. The American tradition, and I'm very proud to be an American, let me just say that straight out, comes from the other end of the spectrum. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So the American tradition emphasizes individualism, and that's, I think, very precious. But it gets us into real trouble when we're talking about a contagious disease. And because what I do affects what you do, what happens to you, whether I intend it to be that way or not. So I think the kind of American objections on behalf of some Americans to being vaccinated is really, frankly, immoral, because you're not taking into account what your actions are doing to me. Even on a libertarian basis, I'm able to swing my hand until it reaches your nose, right? So in the same sort of a way, even if you're emphasizing liberty, you've got to understand that there've got to be limits to liberty. And especially when we're talking about a contagious disease, that means that we have to protect others as well as ourselves.
Indeed. Well, Professor Lennox, could you respond to that introduction from your perspective?
Well, my reaction to all of that is to resonate with it virtually 100%. And the reason for that is the foundation for my own Christian faith is the Hebrew Scriptures. And therefore, the things that Rabbi Elliot has emphasized are immensely important to me. And I think I would start here in the very interesting situation that you mentioned. There are two problems: the problem of natural evil, or the problem of pain, the problem of moral evil. And what strikes me as fascinating is that when we look at the book of Job, which Rabbi Elliot mentioned, we find that the sources of his problems are both of those things. They are two murderous raids by Sabaeans and Chaldeans on his family, that's moral evil, and there are two natural disasters, fire and wind. And it strikes me that the Hebrew Scriptures were very aware of those two sources of evil. And of course, the harder one to deal with, actually, is the problem of natural evil. In a sense, we understand to a certain extent that human beings created, I believe, with free will, can do bad things, and we may come on to that later. Now, within Christianity, it's very interesting that Christ himself referred to these two sources in a famous story recorded by the historian Luke. And it goes like this. They were in Jerusalem at the Temple Mountain, and there were some present told Jesus about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. For warning of the Holocaust, I fear. And Jesus responded, "Do you think these Galileans were worse sinners than all other Galileans because they suffered this way? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish." And then he refers to natural evil. Or those 18, he said, who died when the tower in Siloam fell on them. Do you think they were more guilty than all others living in Jerusalem? I tell you, no. But unless you repent, you too will all perish. Now, it seems to me that's virtually identical with the situation as described by Job, and what is very important in it. And my experience of this is arriving in New Zealand just a few days after the tsunami. And it was interesting watching the different worldviews responding to that. There were Christians who responded citing the Psalms, "We won't be moved even though the mountains fall into the sea." And then there were the pantheists saying, well, it's just karma, so there's no point in helping the victims. And some of them were actually saying, well, this is God's will. This is God stepping in. It's their fault. And what I find very important in this whole debate is that Job was exonerated by God, so that if you're a victim of this kind of stuff, and this is very important pastorally, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are suffering because of something you yourself did. And Jesus says exactly the same thing. And what I'd add to this that seems to me important is that there are not only two sources of suffering, there are two perspectives. It's one thing to be a surgeon or a medic coping with COVID. It's another thing suffering COVID. And so there's a huge pastoral dimension as well as an intellectual dimension to all these problems. But I think that it's very interesting to me to just see how the roots, and Rabbi Elliot said something that, again, it resonates with me, that this individualism that creates a great deal, Enlightenment individualism that creates a great deal of the negative response to vaccination, that is not the teaching of Christianity, because the basic teaching is, of course, coming from the Hebrew Scriptures. Love your neighbor as yourself. We're in a community. And when I was thinking of being vaccinated, my wife and I, we were talking about the sheer importance of protection of family and friends. And so it seems to me that the Jewish view that it's a moral obligation, I would underwrite that 100%.
Well, I'm glad we're all in agreement, but I do want to go back to you. We'll start now with you, John, if I may use your first name. And
of course you may.
Yeah, and I want to bring to the attention of the audience this lovely short book that John has just written, Where is God in a Coronavirus World? So could you give us kind of a short answer to the question that you yourself posed, which will keep us still in the realm of theology, not so much in the realm of ethics, but more in theology. And how do you answer the questions, especially in regard to the issue of divine power and the issue of divine justice?
Well, this is the hard problem, and it's been a hard problem for centuries. And we argued till late in the night, surely an all-powerful God and an all-good God could, should, etc., etc. And what I've noticed philosophically is we never get a satisfactory answer. And I'm a mathematician, and when you can't answer a difficult question, what you do is try and ask a different question and see if you can make some progress with it. And the question that I've come up with, Hava, if I may call you that,
yes, indeed,
is equally difficult, but I believe it gets us further. And that is the question. Any philosophy or religion worthy of the name has got to face the mixed picture the world presents to us. I call it barbed wire and beauty, or bombs and beauty. We've got to accept that. Now, granted that so is, my question is this: is there anywhere any evidence that there exists a God who both cares and who we can trust with it, even though many questions, existential questions, may remain unanswered? And my answer is yes, there is. And it lies right through the whole of Scripture, the whole Judeo-Christian tradition, with the concept of a God who himself suffers. And we see that shadowed in Isaiah's predictions of suffering, which I as a Christian believe were completely fulfilled in Christ. And my question is, if as a Christian I believe Yeshua was the Son of God, then the logical question is, what is he doing on a cross? And the minimal reaction to that is, it shows at least that God has not remained distant from human suffering, but has become part of it. The final point I would make, Rabbi Elliot has already brilliantly made, and that is this: if there was no hope of resurrection or life after death, I wouldn't be on this program. I think that is the key thing, that there's a dimension after death, and I believe the judge of all the earth, as Abraham learned, will surely do right. But is there enough evidence? And I don't simply mean intellectual and historical, but existential evidence in our experience. And I believe that we find that in the revelation of God in the Tanakh and in the New Testament.
Yes. Well, Elliot, you have a lot to respond to.
Yes, indeed. And thank you for that, John, if I may, and Elliot is fine. So first of all, in regard to the existence, I think John is absolutely right. The fact that there is such a thing as moral evil is a function of the fact that we have free will. And you might say, well, maybe God should have created us without free will, so that we would not have to endure the bad use of free will that sometimes we ourselves perpetrate and sometimes others perpetrate on us. But that would mean that we would be automata, right? That God would have sort of hardwired us to do the right thing. And Jeremiah in chapter 31 talks about God as getting very frustrated with the people of Israel, and he threatens that that's going to happen, right? In other words, that what I'm going to do is write my law on your heart. That literally means to hardwire you so that you cannot do something which is wrong. Now, in some ways, I guess that would get rid of the problem of moral evil. But on the other hand, it would also get rid of the problem of moral good, right? Because you could not possibly choose to do the right thing, even in adversity, even if there are good reasons not to do the right thing. So, I mean, the fact and the way, certainly the way that the Jewish tradition has seen this is that it is actually a mark of God's power that God was able to create us with free will and therefore to challenge God.
Yes.
And that has turned out to be a model for the Jewish tradition ever since. We challenge each other. The Talmud is one page after another of arguments. The usual joke is where there are two Jews, there are at least three opinions, except that I mentioned that one time at a Scotland Residence Weekend, and a man came up to me afterward and said, "Do you really need two Jews for three opinions?"
Well, you've given me a very interesting new insight into Jeremiah. That's new to me, and this hardwiring fascinates me. I often say to people, Elliot, you would love God to make a world in which nothing would go wrong at the moral level. Now, the problem at the natural evil level is
that's
more
another
complex.
story.
Yes, but at the moral level. But I say, do you realize you wouldn't be in such a world? Because the most precious thing about you is your capacity to choose. And that not only leads to the possibility of good and bad, it leads to the possibility of love.
Yes.
Because you'd be in a world without love. And therefore, I say, if you want to wish yourself out of existence, that's fine. I can make a world which completely obeys me, as you say, an automatic world, but there'd be nothing in it. There'd be no existential value in it. And
that's right.
This argument needs to be explained because people are too quick to reject the God explanation because they go into this kind of a philosophical twist and they don't realize they're out of existence.
Yes.
Yeah.
So on the natural evil part, in other words, why is it that people suffer and get ill and often without any complicity whatsoever? I mean, it's one thing if you smoke 3 packs of cigarettes a day and then get lung cancer. That's one thing. It's another. The vast majority of people who have gotten sick through the virus and who have even died through it had no complicity in that whatsoever, right? Although I must say, that's only partially true in America in any case, because a very high percentage of the people who have died of COVID were not vaccinated.
Yeah, same here.
So there is a certain piece of this that is a matter of your own choices, right? But the issue of natural evil exists in any case, right? Namely, why is it that that sometimes that hurricanes happen, earthquakes happen, tsunamis happen, all of that, right? And that people get sick sometimes, I mean, really literally without any complicity whatsoever. Maimonides actually deals with this. And he puts, I'm going to paraphrase here, but God had the choice of not creating the world at all, or of creating a finite world. But if God were going to create a finite world, then the very notion of finitude, it means that we are limited. That means that we are not going to live forever. It means that we are not going to live without limitations, including limitations on all kinds of things that we would love to have more of, right? We would love to have more love. We would love to have more knowledge. We would love to have no poverty. We would love to have no illness, and so on down the line. But if God was going to create a finite world, then logically that requires that those kinds of things exist, those limitations exist. So God's power is not so great as to be able to do something which contradicts logic. That's Maimonides' point.
Yes. Nonsense remains nonsense, even if you're talking about God.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. So it's really again a favor on God's part that God decided to create a limited world and rather than create no world whatsoever. And so therefore we can still see God as being good in creating a world that nevertheless has these problems.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just briefly, I think we can see that from science. oddly enough, on my way to New Zealand, just after the earthquake, 2 days afterwards, I was reading a book on tectonic plates. And the authors pointed out that the tectonic plates whose motion causes earthquakes and tsunamis are absolutely essential for life. We couldn't live without them. Mm-hmm. And the same is true of viruses. Most of them are not pathogenic, like COVID. We need them. Right. And that just shows us into the complexity of the finitude. Maimonides, who's always worth reading, I find, was exactly right about this.
So that's a nice segue to the second cluster of questions that actually deals with the relation, kind of look at the pandemic in the context of the relationship between science and religion. So, John, we'll since you gave us this nice segue, let me pose the question to you first, and then Elliot will respond. Has the debate about vaccinations, about masking, about testing, has that debate that we've experienced now for nearly 2 years, has it been caused by mistaken perception that science and religion are necessarily in conflict?
I think it's hard to analyze because the causes seem to be quite sophisticated. First of all, you'll find a certain area of moral objection. There was quite a discussion about the fact that the original material used to create the vaccine was aborted fetal material. And a lot of people argued that therefore we shouldn't get vaccinated because of that. And so that's one reason. The other one is, and I think this goes nearer to what you were suggesting, that the various extreme conspiracy theories may arise from a suspicion on the part of some religious people and others. They're suspicious of science. And that is an utter tragedy. And I've spent my life trying to remove those suspicions and to show to people that science and faith in God coexist beautifully. But that would be my initial response to that.
Yes, we definitely are on the same page here. Go ahead, Elliot, if you could respond, and then we'll bring it down to earth one more notch. Yes.
That's okay. The rabbis actually talk about this in terms of whether science is illegitimate for a Jew to follow, and they say definitely not. Olam kaminhago noheg, the world goes according to its custom, as it were, and therefore anisa la samchina, we may not rely on miracles. Now, miracles in the sense of an interruption in the order of nature, right? So we're not allowed to rely on that. I do a lot of bioethics. And so, when you're talking about issues that either at the beginning of life or at the end of life or somewhere in the middle, we're not allowed to rely on interruptions in nature. We're supposed to study nature and figure out how it works. That's very different, by the way, from another understanding of miracle. 3 times a day, a traditional Jew will say, among other things, the Amidah. And in it, there is a prayer. We thank God for your miracles that are with us each day. Now, that's a very different understanding of miracle. If they're with us each day, then it's basically an appreciation of the fact that our bodies work, that there's air to breathe, there's water to drink, and so on, right? That's a religious appreciation of the fact that we're able to live and think and love and so on all together, right? That's a very different understanding of miracle than an interruption of nature. And you get, I think perhaps the person who put this best was ironically the one who created the modern Orthodox world, namely Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch in the 19th century, in which he said he was arguing against his fellow Orthodox Jews that they should not go to the university, they should not study science and so on. And he said, no, on the contrary, God revealed God's nature and God's will in 2 ways. One through the Torah, through revelation, and the other through the way that God created the world. So that if we are going to know what God wants of us, we need to study both in order to, both of God's creations, the revelation at Sinai and the Torah and so on, and also creation, in order to be able to know what God wants of us. So there has been, I'll just put it rather starkly, a love affair between Judaism and science for generations. Including Judaism and medicine. There were a lot of rabbis during the Middle Ages who were also physicians. Maimonides is perhaps the most famous of them, but there were a lot of them. That doesn't happen so much anymore because it still takes more or less the same amount of time to become a rabbi, but it takes much, much longer to become a physician. I was at actually a conference at the University of Virginia Medical School, and which the dean of this medical school said, in Mr. Jefferson's medical school, it took 1 year to become a doctor, because in the 1700s, that's all they could teach you. Now it's 4 years of pre-med, 4 years of medical school, a year of internship, 3 years of residency, postdocs, all of that, right? So there are not a lot of people who can be both MDs and rabbis, but there are some still. But there is a real commitment on the part of the Jewish tradition to study both Torah and science.
Yes, so both of you are for this kind of, shall we call it, a more dialogical understanding of the relationship between religion and science. But that's not the case in American public discourse. I don't know about England. In American public discourse, the two have been presented, especially during the pandemic, as necessary, as mutually exclusive. So if you believe in science, you're going to do X. If you don't believe in science, you're going to do Y, right? So I would like to pose the follow-up question as follows. Has the pandemic impacted religious community more severely than its impact on secular communities? And if so, what do scientifically minded theologians, such as the two of you are, should say to those diverse communities? Clearly, the Orthodox community, both in America and in Israel, has, you can tell us more about it, Elliot. So could you please respond to this question?
Right. So first of all, I'm a conservative rabbi, right? So I'm in the middle. The Reform on our left and Orthodox on our right. And even the modern Orthodox have been very much on board with the requirement to get vaccinated. It's really the Haredim, right, the ultra-Orthodox, who have resisted that. And then I think is a function of several things. Number one is they see modernity in general as a threat to their Jewish living. It's not just in science and medicine, it's everything else that modernity has brought with it. Philosophy and economics and interfaith work and all of that kind of thing, right? So they are isolated in the way frankly, in the neighborhoods in which they live, the stores they frequent, the texts that they study, all of that, right? Which has led to major problems, not just in the pandemic. In Israel, the Haredi community is very, very poor and dependent upon Israeli government support in order to be able to live. The men never learn a trade, never learn an ability to be able to earn a living. So, I mean, I think this is just terrible. I mean, I would never be a Haredi Jew for all kinds of reasons, but this is one of them. And actually, one of the things that my movement did, which I thought was really clever, was that they put at bus stops in the Haredi communities, they put a list of the rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud and what they did for a living. Right. And so they should show that you're supposed to learn these kinds of things. Right. But the other piece of it is that along with it, they also are, along with their distrust of modernity, they distrust science and medicine and all of that. And it has come at a very high price. I mean, they have died literally at much higher rates than the rest of the Jewish community. And it's you know, and if anything comes out of the Jewish community, out of the Jewish tradition, it's pikuach nefesh. It's the fact that you have to try to save a life. First your own, and then those around you, right? So you've got to, I frankly think that what they're doing is not only, frankly, stupid, but also untraditional. I think it's just un-Jewish in terms of what they're doing. But I'm a conservative rabbi; they won't listen to me.
Yes. So let's hear how are things done in England, and do you have communities, religious communities in England that suffered more from the pandemic because of resistance, let's say, to vaccination?
that's hard to say, but I'd like to just say, first of all, that on the first part of your question, the coexistence of science and religion, one of the writers that has helped me a lot is Lord Jonathan Sacks, the ex-chief rabbi of the UK. And he once said that science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts them together to see what they mean. And a lot of the confusion and the debate comes that people do not realize that the natural sciences answer completely different questions from Judaism or Christianity, the religious tradition. They are more concentrating on the why of purpose than from how does this work and how does it fit. And I believe that if people could only see that, it would take a huge amount of the heat out of the whole debate. But in England, I find it hard to assess because there are different things happening. It was very interesting to see the results of the Pew research. And they discovered that more Americans, believe it or not, than people in other advanced economies say that COVID-19 has strengthened their faith. And 30% of US adults say the outbreak boosted their faith and tightened family bonds, whereas in the United Kingdom, it's only about 10 to 14%. But one of the things that has come out, there was a big study done in the University of York on this, and it's quite interesting because they felt in a survey of 5,500 people, they discovered that one striking result was how strongly non-church members have been affected by the closure of buildings and activities. And they record, and I quote, if there was one clear message from non-church people, it's summed up in this: these places must remain open. They are essential to the community. And I think this is something that Rabbi Elliot has just been emphasizing, the vast importance of recovering community and a sense of community. And of course, there's all sorts of speculation as to why the churches were in some countries put under much more stringent lockdown regulations. For instance, in the Netherlands, they discovered that there was far less risk of transmission of the virus in religious buildings such as churches and synagogues than there was in the family, and yet they closed the synagogues and the churches. So the wonder is then, is this really flowing out of science, or is it reflecting an anti-religious prejudice? And in Europe, of course, that's running very high. Materialism, secularism are running very high indeed. I don't know whether that answers the question, but there's a lot of stuff to be thought about. And one Polish expert on this said it'll be much more difficult to restore believers' trust in their governments, where today many of them have a sense of being abused by the authorities. But I don't know whether that's really addressed your question.
No, this is obviously we can say more about specific communities. I would imagine that in England, like in Israel, maybe the Muslim community has been affected more, because in Israel, the Arab community has been affected very much like the Orthodox Jews, impacted by So I just wonder kind of the details, which I don't know. But let's move on, because your comment really, again, nicely moves us to the third and last part of our conversation, and that's the ethical and the more practical dimensions. What do we do? How do we behave? So to both of you, I will pose the question, what are the imperatives that enable us to conduct ourselves ethically and morally during the pandemic? We are all confused, and we really don't know, and we get conflicting kind of approaches from secular and religious forces. So give our audience a moral guidance, if you could. What do we need to do? What is the imperative that guides us? John, maybe we'll start with you and then Elliot.
Well, I'll start with what Elliot said a few minutes ago. Pikuah nefesh and sakanat nefeshot. In other words, we save a life and we avoid danger to life. These are the basic things that lie at the heart of original medicine. And they are so important, and they're utterly embedded in biblical tradition. And of course, the New Testament takes over these things as utterly central and summed up in "you shall love your neighbor as yourself." And it starts with me. And in this question of vaccination, face mask, and all this kind of thing, that's what I've tried to do in my own limited way. Protect other people, protect my family, my children, my wife, and so on, and other people around, and be a model to other people. That would be my immediate response to the question.
Mm-hmm. Elliot, we'll go to you.
First of all, amen to everything that John just said. But I want to add one other dimension to this. Here again, the Jewish tradition is rather different from the Western philosophical tradition. In the Western philosophical tradition, starting with Plato, there's a very sharp dichotomy between body and mind. Yes. The body is the animal in you, the mind is the distinctively human in you, such that the mind-body problem continues to be a stock issue in Western thought. Where, if the mind and the body are so separate, how are they connected, and all of that? In the Jewish tradition, well, the Talmud tells a story that a man had an orchard and he left it in the control of a blind man and a lame man, and he said to them, "Don't eat of any of the fruit of the orchard." And as soon as he left, the blind man said to the lame man, "This is easy. I'll put you on my shoulders. You'll show me where to go. We'll eat of the fruit of the orchard. He'll never figure out how we did it." So that's what they do. And when the owner comes back, he said, "I thought I told you not to eat of any of the fruit of the orchard." Lame man says, "I couldn't possibly have done it. I can't get there." The blind man says, "I couldn't have done it. I can see it, but I can't even see where it is." And the owner put the lame man on the shoulders of the blind man and said, "This is how you did it. This is how you'll be judged." Similarly, says the Talmud, the body says, "I can't be responsible for a person's sins because without the neshama, the life breath within me, I am like an inert stone. And just as a stone cannot sin, that's me." But and the neshama is like, it says, "I'm just like an ethereal bird without a body. I can't do anything." So God takes the neshama and throws it. That's literally the Talmud's word, ramin. He throws it into the body and says, "This is how you were created, and this is how you will be judged." Now, it's a simple story, but it flies in the face of all Western thought, because what it says is that our internal being, our mind, our emotions, and our will are integrally connected to our bodies, and vice versa. So the way we treat our bodies will have an effect on how we think about ourselves, how we feel about ourselves, and what we do, what we choose to do, and vice versa. How we think about ourselves and feel about ourselves will affect how we treat our bodies. What the virus has shown us beyond any doubt is that our mental health is at least as important as our physical health. Mm-hmm. And that the kinds of, the spikes in depression and suicide and alcoholism and family violence and traffic accidents and all of that, right, have been a function of the fact that we have been detached from families, communities, school, all of that, right? And so that I think one of the things that comes out of this, one of the ethical things that comes out of this, is that we definitely do have to take account and take care of both our physical being in the way that John was talking about, vaccinations, mass social distancing, and so on. But we also, by the way, and also exercise. Okay. But we also have to take account of both our own and those our own mental health and that of those near and dear to us.
Yeah, yes, sure. So,
yeah,
we have a story like your story, where in Ireland, a man who thought he was a Christian, he'd been caught stealing, and the judge said, "Explain yourself," and he said, "Well, it was the old man did that," referring to Paul's teaching on the old nature. And the judge said, "That's fine. We'll give the old man 6 months." So, absolutely. I would want to make distinctions, but this is a discussion for another time, between mind and brain. But I take your point about psychosomatic unity. And it's immensely important with the coronavirus. And you're right, the whole mental side of it is something that we need to take very seriously. So I'm not so steeped in so-called what you call Western tradition than you might imagine. And I'm very aware of these things. That again, it's the biblical worldview dimension that provides the corrective. And that is what we need to hear. I mean, one of the most important messages I believe that we have for the world is that human beings have immense dignity because in all their complexity, they are made in the image of God. And that is the message that I want to get across to people because it makes sense. And in no other religion or philosophy or worldview do we get that value.
That's right.
Mm-hmm. So all of us, we are now coming to the end of our wonderful conversation, but all three of us seem to be more or less on the same page. We are both in agreement. But can you say for the audience, respond by way of conclusion to the following question: how can we ensure that the COVID-19 pandemic bring us closer together rather than tearing us apart? Elliot, we'll start with you.
Well, I think more than anything else, the COVID pandemic has shown us what Aristotle said a long time ago, that we are social animals, that we very much need to be with each other. Granted, everybody needs some time alone, definitely, right? But we also need a lot of time together. And one very sort of stark way of understanding this is just to think about the prison environment. Aside from execution and torture, solitary confinement is the harshest penalty, right? And we have a lot of evidence, unfortunately, that people who are held in solitary confinement for long periods of time go insane. We literally need each other, and we need to be able to connect with each other. Frankly, I'm really sick of teaching classes on Zoom, but thank God for Zoom, because without it, we would not have been able to do anything for 2 years. So by all means, stay safe physically, but do reach out to other people. Maybe not reach out and touch people, maybe not, right? But depending upon who they are and all of that, right? But do reach out by Zoom, by FaceTime, by phone. The phone still works, by the way.
By letters.
Yes.
That's right. Exactly. Letters. Imagine that. And by the way, I want to say this to men, especially because women are better at communicating by phone and that kind of thing with each other than men are. Men usually do this only when there's an agenda. There's something that has to be talked about, right? Guys, you've got to learn how to just be, especially because you're not meeting at, I don't know, playing sports or something like that as often as you used to. It's really important to be able to reach out and get in contact with your family, your friends, all of that.
And John, and your response to that challenging? Well, it's very similar. What I decided to do right at the very beginning was to start to write down names of people that I had little contact with in the past and phone them up. And it was amazing, the result of that. Some of them were slightly irritated because I hadn't talked to them in ages. But afterwards, they said, thank you so much for doing that. And it's the reaching out and the building bridges and building them in new ways. And I've spent a great deal of my life trying to walk in other people's shoes, trying to understand why they think what they think. And we need a lot of that in humility and respect for other people. And my parents taught me, my dad in Ireland was a remarkable man because I saw him live the biblical principles. And in his store, a small store, he employed people from Protestants and Catholics, and we were bombed for it. And I once said to him, why do you do that? He said, because Scripture teaches that all men and women are made in the image of God, and I am going to treat them like that. I've never lost that. That attitude of respect for people that disagree with your worldview is the way to build up relationships, so that if you ask them enough questions about what they believe, they may one time ask you some questions, and then you can give them some answers.